Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Jamie. I know, feel free to gasp. It's been a while. I'm here today with my lovely two co-hosts, Aaron and Matt.
Hey.
Hello.
Before I begin, I want to note that if you could rate or subscribe to our show or leave a review, we'd be very grateful. This is a grassroots effort here, and honestly, it makes us feel good if we know there are people out there enjoying our show besides our parents.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a few of our loyal listeners, we always appreciate the reviews and comments that you leave on Instagram and on our show. That's my call to action there. I don't know, Aaron or Matt, if you have anything else to add there.
We're just excited to be back.
I'm excited to cover a man who I only know the bad parts about him. I think this one, I don't know. I don't want to say it will be more fun because, one, I love my Harold Godwinson.
I know.
I'm a Harold girl, at least for now, but this one, there might be some more questionable things that we will be talking about because William, he gets a bad rap and probably rightfully so in a lot of ways.
I guess we'll find out, right?
Yeah.
I did watch, for those who are tuning in or may have been watching King and Conqueror, I believe it's on Amazon Prime.
It is now out in the U.S. on Amazon Prime. U.S. listeners, if you were waiting for that, I didn't really see an announcement. I just all of a sudden saw that it was out there. So you can find King and Conquer, which covers the stories that we've been talking about in the Harold episodes and continuing on here in Williams.
My boyfriend and I, we watched the first episode. Looks like there's only at least three that were, I don't know if that sounds right, but at least three that were available. He has something that's not, I don't know. I think it's legal. I don't know. It's not on Amazon Prime. It's, we searched it through other sources, but there were 3 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
We watched the first one, and I know they had said it obviously deviates a bit from the history. I thought there were some key moments that I'll reference here in the podcast that are covered, even if it's not action for action. I think it captures a lot of the relationships that William has, but it does pick up when he's already in power, not his childhood.
And that's the part that I don't really know. I mean, I know some broad strokes. I know a lot once William gets to England, I'll say that. But him in Normandy and how he comes to power, I know is quite a story. So I'm excited to follow along and hear about it because it's not a straightforward path.
No. So I'm going to start off with addressing the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the conqueror in the room. I think there's already a question based solely on William the Conqueror's name and reputation to already make a snap judgment. The nickname, right, the Conqueror, doesn't conjure up warm and fuzzy feelings. He's not William the Likeable or William the Sweetheart or William the Sweetie Pie.
No.
But I think if we pause and look at William's story in context, we can at least perhaps find some glimmer of maybe misunderstanding or perhaps maybe too harsh of judgments. To go from being, what we'll learn about here in a minute, the bastard son of a powerful duke, especially a duke who died and left William all too young, we really could see him as a scrappy survivor. Perhaps to take a quote from Harry Potter, we could call him, quote, the boy who lived. As a side note, J.K. Rowling, boo, I'm not giving you credit for that.
We're not endorsing J.K. Rowling and her craziness.
Yeah, that for some reason that popped out at me when I was thinking that.
That is the one thing I know about Mr. William is that he was a young boy when he came to power, which if you've listened to our show, we've had plenty of young children in power, and typically that doesn't bode well. It's usually things don't go great for them and the country.
No, right. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so we'll start with just William. The main source I used for my research was William the Conqueror by David Bates, which is part of the Yale English Monarch series. I also watched a few short documentaries on YouTube where actually David Bates is also interviewed. So unless I note otherwise, it's most likely coming from the book source of William the Conqueror. We're going to roll the clock back to 11th century Normandy, which is a duchy perched on the northern edge of modern France, where William's story begins not with a throne, but with a family tree, very much like Harold, that looks more like a tangle of roots and branches. It's a lot of complicated relationships. So if the name Normandy sounds familiar to you, Many of you would most know this area from World War II and D-Day. This is the area in northern France where the seaborne invasion took place.
Like Omaha Beach. If you've watched Band of Brothers, if you've watched Saving Private Ryan, it's the same place. It's right over the channel. I think that's the important thing is it's very close.
It's a very critical place. Obviously, being not only close to the water, but being that close to England makes it very important, a duchy compared to some of the others.
Very easy to hop on over, as we will see. Then Kings of England will continue after. I know, getting a little ahead of myself, but they will continue to be able to go back and forth. The kings and the aristocracy will go back and forth between England and Normandy for, the next, couple hundred years?
Yep, so popular place.
But not using the channel, right?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. Just asking a profoundly stupid question, but there is no channel. I'm going to be more in the dark on this particular podcast than I've ever been before. I guess the ancestor of the fairy is there, but that's about it.
Yeah. William probably wished there was a channel. That would be a lot more convenient.
Yeah, that made things, it was pretty easy for him, let's be honest, but would have made things even easier. We'll see the future dynasty, William's future dynasty, will find a lot of heartache on the channel. If you know your English history and the White Ship disaster, the channel will take a lot from the English royal family in the future.
So William was born either in 1027 or 1028 into the House of Normandy. He's not royal as in like a king, but he's in a very powerful duchy in France. He's not a prince in the way that we think like, oh, he's next in line for the throne itself, especially not in France. So just to kind of clarify that, I think sometimes it's easy to be like, because he's so powerful that thinking that he's naturally royal in the way that we think of it. Normandy, obviously very powerful duchy, and he's the eldest of two illegitimate children of the Duke of Normandy, Robert the Magnificent, and his concubine, Herleva. She's also known as Arlette. I've seen it both places, both in the books and in documentaries. So she's a woman with no clear noble blood, but she's also not like a peasant. She's said to be the daughter of a tanner, which will come back later in a story where William's anger is going to come out. So I'm just going to note that she's supposedly the daughter of a tanner. So she's no peasant, like as I said, to be clear. She'll later go on to marry a viscount. Is that how you say it, right? Viscount? Why am I doubting myself?
Viscount. I'm thinking Bridgerton. The Viscount and the Viscountess.
Oh, yeah, Viscount. There we go, right. But that will happen only after Robert's death. So Robert isn't married, and neither is she at the time.
He doesn't have a duchess.
Nope.
He just has the separate relationship. We did talk about in our Harold, part 1, about the complicated weirdness of marriage at this time. I don't know, Matt, do you want to do a quick summary if people are just clicking on this episode and they haven't listened to Harold part 1? I'm putting you on the spot. Do you want to do a quick explanation of what marriage was like in the 11th century? Think of Harold and his multiple wives.
Eventually, marriage becomes very much codified and irreversible as a binding sacrament. But during this period, since Europe is still, especially Northwestern Europe, is still going through kind of a blending of pre-Christian marriage rituals and traditions, and the Catholic Church's power is not quite what you're going to see, 200 or 300 years down the road, where you'll have monarchs bending the knee to Rome and needing it.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. The sophisticated term for it is investiture, the power to install someone as a church official. That's very much held as like a secular power, or we would see it as a secular power. That's actually going to be one of the arguments that the Tudor monarchy will make, that it's like, we're not really breaking away from Rome in a rebellious, progressive, radical way. We're just returning the English church
going back to this,
to its roots. But anyway, all of which is to say, we'll just say marriage was more flexible and your spouse didn't necessarily have to have the endorsement of the church. Is that kind of what you were going for with your question?
Yeah, I know there will be some people who will be coming to this episode without having listened to the last one. So just as an explanation. Although here we're not seeing two wives. If you go to our Harold episode, you'll know that there's two Ediths, and then Canute had two wives as well.
In King and Conqueror, you see Edith, and there's conflict. She's concerned that Harold's dad was going to cast her away because their marriage is not.
It's not a church-sanctioned marriage. But here we don't have a duchess. So Robert wouldn't have any legitimate kids then.
Now, in a few sources, they mention perhaps it's very, very vague that he might have been married to somebody in 1030 Eastrith, but it's only really mentioned in one or two sources. So a lot of people think they might be referring to Robert's dad. So it gets a little kind of iffy in the records, but most people say he was not married, but he for sure did not have any legitimate kids. So when William is young, he's known during this time as William the Bastard. Not exactly the most noble title for a king. It's like, okay, we get it. I'm considered illegitimate, but maybe focus on another quality about me besides that.
That's all you get. That's what I just remember when we learned about him in French class. It was William le Bâtard, the bastard.
Exactly. And obviously, it's like, oh, he didn't really have any choice in the matter. When you're the son of Robert the Magnificent and you're William the Bastard, just seems a little
downgrade,
a little iffy. At first, I really focused on that name, and I was thinking, okay, that means he's going to really be treated more negatively. But during my research, I was surprised, and I think this really kind of goes hand in hand with the marriage piece, that while William was described as a bastard by contemporary sources during his life, it doesn't mean that the term has that same significance for everyone. From Bates's book, quote, "It is probable the more successful William became, the more likely this influence would have been written about him," end quote. So obviously, as he became more prominent, it's going to lose a lot of that connotation because he's going to be king of England, spoiler alert. Over the years, the fact that his parents weren't married has been massively influenced, of course, by interpretations at various times in history when that was not so accepted. Of course, the view of birth out of wedlock was prominent in most of
late medieval,
right,
or early modern or Victorian, especially Victorian, because that's where so much of our history, especially English history, like the Tudors, a lot of the mythologies, those were all pretty much based in Victorian ideals, and those were the historians that were making a popular history. They would not look so kindly on a kid born out of wedlock.
Right.
But yeah, as we said, it's still not quite the same as if he had been born out of wedlock in, say, 1400 or 1500.
100%. It was very much, I don't want to say totally accepted, but especially for somebody like Robert, we're going to talk about here shortly, there was never really any doubt that William was going to be his heir. There wasn't like this whole piece of, well, he's not legitimate or anything like that.
If you don't have another family to compete, this is what you got. You got William.
But there were other family members who we'll talk about as part of Robert's bigger family that don't play a very good role once William is a young duke. There could have been much more pushback, but as I said, that tells us something about his role as bastard, that it wasn't seen quite through the eyes that we tend to see it. And even just based on the nickname, we tend to think, oh, this must have been this huge negative impact on his life. And while there were certainly some aspects that we'll see, his political legitimacy was not, I would say, on the top of the list. It's more of those interpretations that come later. And like you said, Victorian and much of the 20th century, where those views of birth out of wedlock are much more strict and have negative connotations to them. One of the main historians writing about William, not at the same time that he was alive, this is in the 12th century, at least 150 years past when he was around. But this is, I would say, one of the earlier accounts. We don't get too much contemporaries of William. This historian, William of Jumièges, not at all confusing with two Williams. So different William. This is the historian.
I know. There's so many Williams. At least how many Ediths will there be in this episode? Do we need to keep count?
No, I will mention Edith, though, here shortly. You're Edith Swanneck. There were two main historians during the 12th century who cover William, and William Jumièges, he was probably the more straightforward of the two, less biased on William's side. And even he always presented William's life as somebody who was going to be successor and someone who was politically legitimate. Bates writes in his book, quote, "It is clear that, as we shall see, Jumiez did have problems with other aspects of William's conduct, but he did not present his birth as being one of them," end quote. The book does even note that the near contemporary parallel to William's parents would be Harold
and Edith Swan Neck.
Exactly.
There's our Edith.
One Edith will do the count, at least one.
Yeah. Despite my intro, I learned that, again, this quote comes from Bates, quote, "Any notion of William having a socially disadvantaged childhood because of the circumstances of his birth is a total myth. He was not always destined to be Robert's successor, and his actual succession was certainly the consequences of circumstances and events working in his favor, the main one being his father's death on the pilgrimage." This is my part, spoiler alert, in 1035, at a time when there were no possible serious alternatives to him. But once robust, good health was apparent, at least his future was certainly going to be that of a high-status aristocrat, end quote. Not socially disadvantaged or pushed into the side and not being referenced as Robert's heir. Potential other people in Robert's family, we'll see. This is like at any time, and I would say across Europe at this time, the throne is not always easily passed down. So it's not that he didn't have any threats. But once William lived to a certain age, it was pretty clear that he would, if not be the successor, he was at least going to be high up in the aristocracy or the nobles.
He's being groomed for that. I assume he's being educated for that.
Yep, I'll talk about what we know about his education here shortly. Little side note, more about William's parents. According to 12th century writers, William's parents, quote, "had been a close and loving couple," end quote. And one writer, Wace, at the time, he wrote, quote, "elaborated the earlier stories with an account of the couple's intimate lovemaking."
No.
And of Robert's tenderness to Arlette, end quote. I'm like, okay, Wace, I don't know how you got that one.
Are you interviewed? How do you know?
I don't know.
Impressive research.
That's like what any historian wants to know. As an American history teacher, what Matt would give to know about Martha and George Washington's sex life.
Intimate lovemaking.
I don't know about that. But we'll never know because she, as soon as he's dead, she burns all the letters. So
come on.
To be fair, I'm going to say it. Sweet. I do love a good love story back then.
Love match.
Yeah, although obviously there's some power dynamics here that I don't love, but it does sound like they got on well in all the forms and all the places.
Right.
Including the bedroom.
Not sure where Wace from the 12th century got that. Of course, they're also going to have a certain bias because these are William the Conqueror's parents. At least we can see that there's positive relationship between the two. Another place where you can see that bias of obviously looking in the past a few hundred years. You see this in one of Malmesbury, another historian. He wrote that, quote, "The midwife proclaimed with the infant William that the child was going to be king," end quote. I mean, probably did not happen, obviously.
They love their prophecies. They love their predictions. Yeah. I'm going to go with it was written after the fact or made up after the fact.
Yeah, I doubt anybody was talking about that during William's lifetime. Despite me basically saying that William had a stable childhood with loving parents, doesn't mean that being a bastard and being part of a royal family meant he was completely safe. In those days, even being a son, especially when considered still a bastard, meant you didn't necessarily have a set future. As we said, most likely he was going to be Robert's heir, but there was no automatic title, and there were plenty of ambitious family members, uncles, and such circling like hawks. And any weakness in a family line could and often did lead to instability. So William's father, in fact, Robert, had been involved in a brief rebellion that had failed against his older brother, Duke Richard III, during his short reign. So Richard only reigned for a short time. And some writers mention the possibility that Richard, his death might have not been a natural one, although more likely it was all due to the factors that we know played at the time, illness and things like that.
This is funny because if you know what happens to William the Conqueror's sons, you could see history repeating itself, we shall say. They also have a lot of infighting and possible murders or maybe natural deaths. Seems like if you're royalty or a duke at this point, there's going to be some jostling, especially we're in a time before primogeniture really is the rule of the land. We talked about in the Harold episodes, it's might over right. Bloodline's important, but again, they all have good blood. So it's about who can really be as ruthless as possible, unfortunately, which does make for maybe good rulers, but not great men, if you know what I mean.
And that's what we're going to see, obviously, with William. That's going to be a lesson he's going to learn. I'm not going to talk too much about Robert, William's father, Duke Robert, but he had spent, obviously, much of his early rule just trying to keep the peace and keep his throne. Robert, like later his son, he had a really keen sense of politics. He did support church reforms, and he poured a lot of resources into monasteries. Yes, partly because he was known as being pious, which later will be part of his decision to go on his ill-fated pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but also because it gave him this moral authority in a world where he tried to have some of this legitimacy, tried to have some more of that backing. He was also playing a delicate game in France, often clashing with Brittany, sometimes backing King Henry I of France. These moves all helped Normandy play a bigger role in European politics than you would normally think of just a duchy in France. So Normandy was not just the side note. They were a powerful player.
They're punching above their weight.
Yes, 100%. Unsurprising for anyone watching William the Bastard the early years, you'd be witnessing a mix of court politics, feudal loyalties, and a kind of dynastic games that most of us are used to seeing in shows like Game of Thrones. As a side note, we know this comparison is a little bit on the nose, as the actor who plays Jaime Lannister on the show Game of Thrones portrays William in the show King and Conqueror. So a little side note there. You have a little connection. Anyways, this real life was just as dangerous, I would say, as that show, except for maybe minus the dragons.
Oh, no dragons? Oh.
No, or as our mom would say,
"You dragons."
Ew, dragons. So she'd be happy. She'd be like, okay, good. There's no dragons in this.
Mom's not a fan of anything fantasy, fantastical.
Dragons, orcs, anything. I just remember Lord of the Rings, trying to tell her about that. Yeah, she doesn't like ugly creatures.
I think she called the orcs literally ugly creatures.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe she'd like unicorns or something that are cute.
I don't know. She'd find some reason not to like them. Sorry, Mom.
Right. Just a little side note. For William, again, his real life was just as dangerous as a lot of the politics that you see on the show. So in the book, Bates notes that, quote, competition and violence were innate in the politics of this northern French world in which William grew up, end quote. Norman chronicles portray William's childhood as shaped more by strategic exposure rather than lullabies. So he learned to read the political weather early. Who owned whom, who could be trusted, and where danger might lurk around any corner. The social map he navigated was dense. So you have vassals, you have fellow nobles, and you have competing claims from within his own family. So you have to remember, as we had said, this is a time where there's lots of competing groups for power and leadership. A reoccurring thread is that William's path wasn't a straight line to greatness. It was a rigorous apprenticeship in sovereignty, where every landowning, every vow, every marriage could tilt that balance of power. In another, I guess, Game of Thrones type reference or comparison, you were never safe in your position or your family's position. I think it's a little hard for some of us to imagine that in the modern era. We don't see Prince Andrew and his Epstein pals trying to take over from
King Charles, no.
I know, I'm sorry. I know, it's too hard. King Charles, I apologize. Or any distant cousin claiming legitimacy and raising up an army, right? We don't tend to see that in the modern age.
Not to compare it with Harold, but since they are dueling, we are actively comparing the two. You know, we see what happens with Harold and his brother Tostig. Just because you have the same bloodlines doesn't ensure that you're going to be on the same side. Same here, where William's going to have a hard time growing up in this viper's nest, honestly. Yes, you get the luxury of a medieval palace, but it's a lot. You can never really feel safe, even when you're in power.
And then when you do have a family, you never feel that your children are safe. Just perpetual anxiety.
Mm-hmm. One quote I think that shows those contradictory values at the time between competition and feuds, as well as atonement and religious patronage, especially when it comes to Robert. Quote, "It looks as if the young William was growing up not only at a time when his father's rule was increasingly secure and successful, but also in an atmosphere where atonement for sin and religious patronage were central part of everyday life. Associated influences on the adult William may have been profound, both in the terms of the practice of politics and the conduct required of him," end quote. Definitely sees his father as somebody who is finding that balance basically between a fighter and also a pious individual or somebody who's trying to get back to the church.
Do you have to do both?
Yeah.
I mean, Harold, he was both, and Godwin before him, Harold's dad. You have to be at this time both a ruthless warlord as well as a great patron of religious institutions. We saw the struggle of Edward the Confessor when he just had that religious portion that was important, but then you're outsourcing the warring to Harold, and that created problems down the line because you don't really know who's in charge. Somebody might be king,
Right.
But we saw Harold creep into grabbing more and more of kingship.
Exactly. In order to be somebody who is a powerful leader, you really do have to have that balance. So William himself, he starts to appear in charters in the 1030s, which indicates this is the time, even though he's really still young, obviously, at this time. He was born in, again, 1027 or 1028. This is when he starts showing up in prominence. So we see on record that Duke Robert sent his young son, William, to an abbey in 1035. This is about when William is about 7 or 8, when Duke Robert went on his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We also have an indication of William's importance in the kingdom because there was a provision publicly made for his education with a tutor named Ralph, last name not given, so I'll just call him Ralph the Tutor, appearing in a charter for an abbey. So we don't have a ton of specific information about the education William received, but we can assume that he was able to understand Latin, even if he may not have been able to read, and he'd be taught the same ethical principles and performative skills that were required of either potential ruler or somebody, again, high up in the nobility. And probably one of the biggest pieces that we could say influenced William's worldview and personality. I have probably the longest quote I will take from Bates, but I think reading it verbatim is pretty important because this will, I think, as Aaron has been saying, this will, I think, give you that worldview that William is going to have and take into his adulthood. Bates says, quote, about William, "He would have also received the training to prepare him for the violence and management, basically the skills to be required, being, when necessary, the ability to kill humans and to hunt animals on a regular basis. The life of such a child involved boisterous and sometimes dangerous from a very young age," end quote. Sounds very, again, Jon Snow, or very, like I said, Game of Thrones. So from a young age, learning about violence and how it can serve you politically and serve power, whether it's killing humans or killing animals. A little bit of a difference.
The hunt was very important in terms of nobility, and it could also be really, really dangerous. We will see, again, spoiler into the future, one of William's sons die in the New Forest, I believe, on the hunt. It's both dangerous, but it's a hobby. I do know William's life will become very surrounded by all kinds of violence here as his father leaves Normandy and leaves little William all by himself to figure things out.
And that's what I'm getting to now. Let's get to it. Let's get to William's father, Robert's death. One of those historians from the 12th century, Jumiez, he had reported that William's father's decision to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was not a popular one around Norman aristocracy, not only because it was obviously an extended absence, but it was also, of course, a risky and long journey. It's obvious, though, that based on all of that, that the decision to go was not an impulsive one for Robert because his departure was carefully prepared. So what we do have of documentation, it wasn't just like a spur of the moment, let's go to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. He had it very much prepared. And this type of pilgrimage was also common among his fellow dukes. So it wasn't completely out of the norm for him to do that. There was a clear understanding that Robert may not return. From Bates's book, quote, "In late 1034 and early 1035, the greatest nobles of the duchy were called together, and in proceedings that closely resembled those of which previous Norman rulers had designated their successor, it was agreed that William should effectively take Robert's place and that he should be the duke if Robert failed to return," end quote. And apparently it was accepted unanimously and with much rejoicing. So there wasn't too much fighting against that choice.
They're making plans, which, yeah, like you said, travel is dangerous. We talked about one of Harold's older brothers dies on the way back to England from a pilgrimage. Even going across channel is difficult, let alone going to the Holy Land. You really do gotta make some plans.
Just in case.
Even if you come back, it'll take years to get back. You'll be gone at least probably 2 years or so.
And that's obviously why the nobles were not the most excited about that, because that extended absence, also in a time when Robert had the kingdom fairly stable, that could lead to potential instability.
It has to be stable enough to go, but then you're chancing for things to fall apart after you're gone as soon as you step foot off of Norman soil.
And William was, at this point, a pretty obvious choice for Robert to choose as his successor. He was said to be particularly loved by his father, not only because he was his only son, but he was also notably strong and handsome, which would be characteristics that would, of course, lead later to his descriptions of being a physically large and strong man, which in this time period are characteristics essential to rule and to successful rule. Now, of course, comes the part that I've already noted multiple times, which is that Duke Robert dies on the return journey from Jerusalem in what is now today modern Turkey in early July 1035. And at ages, that puts William at about 7 or 8, very young. As early as the 1050s, Bates suggests that there were rumors that Duke Robert's death was possibly poisoning rather than natural causes. Actually, that's something that's implied in the first episode of King and Conqueror. There's a scene where somebody admits to having poisoned Duke Robert.
Really?
Yeah. But historians today, knowing obviously the conditions and the dangers of travel in the 11th century, most historians kind of note that this was probably simply some natural causes, not poisoning.
It was dangerous to be a king or a duke, but yeah, if I was a betting woman, I would say natural causes.
So in terms of personal development, as we talk about William as a person, Bates writes that, quote, "William was indisputably exposed to significant risks, in particular the loss of his father at around the age of 8, whose memory is, we shall see, he seems to have revered, could have very well have been important," end quote. So this leads to the discussion on early childhood events, and actually Bates goes into about how adverse childhood events can shape individuals, which I actually thought was really interesting because you don't a lot of times see that in more traditional historical writings.
Obviously, we know so much more about childhood and development now than we did in the 11th century.
Yes, Bates in his books talks about those broader ideas of trauma and anxiety and those factors that influence children when they're under constant stress or other events, like in this case, losing what we can tell, a very close father to William, and how that would influence William and the man he would become. Bates goes into mentioning the idea of resiliency and how that's a dynamic concept, and that William had both protective psychological factors in place. So things like he had a very close mother who protected him. He had other guardians who, for the most part, were protectors, even if it cost them their lives. So he did have some of these protective factors. And also just intrinsically for William, it seems like as an individual, he had a personality that was a particularly resilient and one that could overcome such events. And then, as I said, he also had these external resources that mitigates or lessens these major disruptive factors. So today, like I said, it's something we tend to call adverse childhood experiences. Not to say that William was not affected by these. William's later life definitely suggests a resilient personality, which nowadays it's recognized as that responses to all manners of adversities and trauma can be extremely diverse. So they can either have a strengthening one in resiliency to like later stresses and adversities, or obviously the opposite effect, one that makes you more culpable or more, I guess, weakened in the form of that. If we're looking at William, he seems to have grown more resilient and more willing to take risks and to use his might. However, that doesn't mean we don't want to say that his childhood was all super easy, because now he's going to be the Duke.
He's what, 7, you said? He's so young.
7 or 8.
We've seen, as we've talked about throughout the podcast, numerous episodes, young child kings, child dukes with varied success. Some of them go on and do well.
Have we had any where there's really been a
positive
success story for somebody who's on the throne at 9,
Yeah.
you know, putting down the Nintendo Switch and debating with a chancellor about tax policy?
I don't think we've talked about ones, but I do know of one. We'll say Henry the Third of England. He's King John's son. He comes to the throne at 9, around the same age of William the Conqueror. He's a mixed bag. He doesn't have the best reign. He does have the Barons' War, but he has a very long reign. He has one of the longest reigns, so he is long-lasting, at least in that aspect. But came out of it, unlike William, our William the Conqueror, Henry the Third was more meek, and he loved family, things that I don't think we necessarily associate with William. He was more of a timid man, so you could use him as a foil to William about trauma.
Yeah, and how that can affect various personalities. Speaking about, again, child kings or child dukes, in the 12th century, William of Malmesbury and David Bates in the book also uses that famous biblical quote, "Woe to the land whose king is a child," end quote.
Yeah, it's usually never great. That is the one thing about the example that I used, Henry III, is he has William Marshall, who had been at the side of the last 3 or 4 kings since John's dad, Henry II. He was his first guardian, his first person to help him ease into rule. So it really depends on who you have at your side, if there's somebody who are willing to foster you, or are they going to try to take the throne. Richard III. Now we're going to get a lot of Ricardians coming into our comments.
I guess recapping, if we're looking at William's years before the death of his father, it's important to remember that William was a child with supposedly devoted and loving parents, and he was brought up in an aristocratic lifestyle. But of course, there would be trying times, especially once Duke Robert died. Once he's been named his father's rightful heir, Duke Robert has died. He's officially named William II of Normandy by the King of France, Henry I. So Henry I legitimizes his role. So that's a big step. But he's still a child, and we know what that means. We've just talked about, especially in these times, you might get lucky and, like Aaron said, have a guardian who are protectors of you, or you might be killed by a protector or disappear from the record. So it's one thing to swear an oath of loyalty when the Duke is alive, but when he's dead, there's going to be turbulent times ahead that, for sure, in this case, is going to impact the man who William will become. From the Historic Palace's website and Britannica, it notes how 3 of William's guardians were violently killed, including one in bed next to him when William was 12 years old.
My God.
As well as a tutor. And not only that, but he had to, for a time, go into hiding in the homes of his poor tenants for safety. Even though he has been proclaimed Duke and given the legitimacy by the king, he's not by any means safe.
There's so many parallels. This is reminding me of James I of England.
Yeah.
We didn't cover him, but in George Villiers' episode, we talked about his early life, and it was the same thing where all of his guardians are getting killed. And we saw what became of him. He became obviously very paranoid, rightfully very paranoid.
Right.
Paranoid makes it sound like that there's not a reason, that it's irrational.
Come on, lighten up, James. You're not going to be killed while all these dark assassins are hiding in the corners.
So it's not irrational. This is a very real fear. If you see that many adults dying around you as a child, you're like, it's coming for me next. It is literally the monster hiding under the bed.
Yeah. And these are people who are meant to protect you. And right there, repeatedly, again, 3 being violently killed and his tutor. I'm like, why the teacher? Why are we taking it out on the teacher?
Was it Ralph? Ralph?
I don't know.
Not Ralph, please.
We'll just say it's another minor tutor, not Ralph the tutor.
Phew, okay.
Maybe that's why we don't know Ralph's last name.
Yeah, it could be.
Don't put that on Ralph. I'm really invested in Ralph surviving.
We won't look it up then, just to be safe. So Robert's family was largely unhelpful during this time, knowing that some benefited from William's death, right? They're like, if he dies, well, that might be good for me because I might be able to then step in that place. William's mother was his true protector, so go moms, who is noted to have kept him safe during the most dangerous periods of William's youth. If I'm thinking back to Bates and what he said about trauma and resiliency, you can see how this would build resiliency, that protective factor of his mother, and also could make William later always be ready for violence to break out, with lawlessness occurring across the land at this point, with nobles taking advantage of the young duke's weakness. Again, he's young. There's definitely violence breaking out and people trying to take advantage. So from the documentary, How William the Bastard Became William the Conqueror, they note that from an early age, William learns he cannot trust all those who are around him. He will learn to be wary, and at times he will need to assert his own authority.
And boy, does he. That's my insertion. He will learn to assert his own authority. Just ask the north of England.
Right. So this would be something he would take with him in his future as ruler. Britannica notes that, of course, these issues facing young William probably, as Aaron said, later contributed to William's strength of purpose and his extreme dislike of lawlessness and misrule. He's not going to take that. The conqueror part of William, we could say maybe came about when he was about 15, so years before the Battle of Hastings. So in 1042, when William was 15, he began to rule in his own right, dealing with affairs of the duchy. Yes, the most dangerous time in some ways for William was over because he was not a young kid, but his attempts to recover the power that Normandy had lost during the chaos of his younger years and to bring those disobedient vassals and servants back under his strict control, obviously is going to lead to some trouble. People aren't going to love that. Anybody who suddenly had more power and act like, okay, William, I'll give that back, or let me give you the land back.
They've been taking advantage of this child king, and suddenly he's coming into his adulthood and he's not happy about it. So you're going to have to deal with William the Conqueror as pretty much an adult. I mean, 15 is adulthood pretty much at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. From 1046, so now we're again he's about 19, until 1055, he dealt with a series of rebellions by barons, mostly led by relatives. Thank you, family. At this point, family, I feel like, is more of a
hindrance. Again, to be fair, it's not just him. We'll see his sons repeat it.
This is a pattern, huh?
I'm just thinking Henry II and all his sons also rebelling. Sometimes it's easier if you don't
have a big family.
I think Henry VIII might disagree with me, but sometimes it's easier if you don't have a bunch of kids.
I'm just thinking of this, especially in this time as we approach in the Americas.
Thanksgiving
and Christmas. I really don't want to spend it with all my family because they, might kill me. It feels not so warm and fuzzy.
No, I think there's kinship, but a lot of times they're not obviously spending a lot of time with each other. He's probably not met half of these relatives.
No. William would be ready to teach a lesson to anyone who would threaten his authority. For example, in 1042, he led his first campaign as leader when a lord from western Normandy seized William's castle at Falaise, which held significance because this is where his mother was from, William's mother, and where William himself was born and spent a good amount of his childhood. So it was really a symbol of Normandy's power. We don't have a lot of information about the siege, but essentially William brought a show of force with troops and basically trapped the castle like a siege from being able to get needed goods. While likely there was no true fighting, the lesson was clear that William would not allow any threats to his authority. That doesn't mean that this time was a cakewalk for William and his power. He continued to hone a ruling style that would later define his approach in England. As we said, firm control over vassals. So these were, if you're not familiar with the term vassals, these were powerful people who held land in exchange for loyalty, ultimately to the king, but also to obviously the duke when you're talking about in Normandy. And we'll see how William at one point is going to almost have more power than the king, who's not going to be so happy about that. We'll get there. Of course, you have careful church appointments to secure legitimacy, and you have to have, as we said previously, this talent for balancing force with diplomacy. He also faced practical constraints. He had, as we said, rising threats from rival claimants and his family, shifting loyalties among powerful Norman noble families, and, of course, the ever-present risk of a rebellion that could topple him before he even was completely grown. There were times when he, like in his youth, was in great danger, and he had to go all the way to Henry of France for help, the king. And it was also during these years that William learned to not cower even in the most difficult times. He learned to fight and rule, slowly developing into the William who would fight and win at the Battle of Hastings.
You can really see a trajectory of how he got to be the William that I wouldn't say know and love, but the William that we know. It can be difficult to love this man, but the things that we dislike about him or that he gets knocked on in terms of his personality, you can see where they're coming from if you hear his biography and see how he's gotten here. Although it does apply to so many of them.
Yeah.
Not all of them turn out as ruthless as William.
Right.
But then again, not all of them, are able to take a throne and rule for as long as William did as well.
What else do we know about him besides him being a fighter? He's described as also being moral and pious, which you might maybe chuckle at, but supposedly moral and pious. And he made his half-brother Odo Bishop of Bayeux in 1049. So under William, they really, obviously with his family, strengthened the church in Normandy through donations and administrative skill. What else do we know about him as a man? Other descriptors. According to a brief description by an anonymous author who borrowed extensively from Einhard's biography of Charlemagne, William was described as being just above average height, and he was well built. Britannica called him having a, quote, a robust, thick-set body, end quote.
No. Bean.
I guess that's a compliment. I'm not sure what to make of that.
It's a better compliment than this next one.
Oh, no.
Another great description from Britannica. Quote, although he was always sparing of food and drink, he became fat in his later life, end quote.
I do know a little bit about that in terms of his casket. That is one of the few things I know about William the Conqueror.
That's the casket in the room. We won't get to there yet, but okay, first a robust, thick-set body, and then they're just like, he just became fat in later life.
Do we have to fat shame him? Come on, Britannica. Let's stop talking about bodies so much.
Well, he was also known as a powerful speaker with a low, deep voice. And as his father had predicted, he was exceptionally strong and a hunter and a soldier at his core. Known for being fierce and tyrannical, unsurprising, when his childhood had made Normandy seem to slip away, and he was generally feared. While he had some education, as I noted earlier, he's not known for being particularly scholarly, but he is found to be intelligent and shrewd thanks to both his formal and informal education. And he quickly gained the respect of his rivals. They knew he was definitely not someone you wanted to mess around with.
I feel like he's somebody who has street smarts. He's very savvy in that way, so he might not be as educated as future dukes and kings, but he's certainly canny where you can see him learning, and it doesn't seem like he makes the same mistake twice.
And he's smart, again, when you're saying street smarts, he continues to build alliances with powerful nobles, and he used calculated marriages like his own. He married Matilda of Flanders, and she brings two things to the table for him that are really important. One, she's the niece of King Henry of France.
Yay.
There you go. Especially when King Henry has mixed feelings around William and his power. And she also comes from one of the most prestigious families in Europe because she's the daughter of the Count of Flanders. So her father controlled a powerful region in France that also had maritime access. So this continues to strengthen William's position as he now has Flanders as an ally in case of any threats.
Can I ask something? I don't know if you talk about the marriage later, but there is a often repeated rumor about the marriage.
You can bring it up.
There's this rumor that she refused. She said that she didn't want to marry a bastard. No.
Oh, yeah.
And that he comes and then trigger warning that he came and beat her into submission and then they got married. I don't know if you talk about that or not, because that is one of the things, if you encounter William the Conqueror, people will use that as a smear against him.
I didn't have it brought up, although I was going to mention later that, yeah, there were stories about what the relationship's like. Also, as we're talking about fact versus fiction versus what we know, the ambiguity, in King and Conqueror, it makes them seem like a very politically minded, calculating couple. So obviously, whether or not that's true.
I've heard things. I know that she's really instrumental in keeping, especially when you get to when England becomes part of the mix, that cross-continental family. I know she keeps things moving pretty well. I don't think of her as like a Queen Elizabeth ruling on her own later, but that she's another politically savvy person. Whether or not the story about them before their marriage is true, their relationship does become close and loving for the time for an arranged marriage.
Exactly. Especially one for this that's essentially a calculated political move to get William more power. In many ways, as I had hinted at earlier, William was becoming more powerful than the King of France himself. In 1054, the king, in fact, plans an invasion of Rouen, which is a central place in Normandy, to demonstrate his power over William, basically to take him down a notch, trying to teach him a lesson. Norman women and children, trigger warning for violence, they're slaughtered across Normandy as the king's men march towards Rouen. But William doesn't act yet. And this is something you'll see in the future. He would use battle avoidance until ready. That was kind of his tactic. In this case, one night, French soldiers had been indulging a little bit too much on the alcohol after a hard day of plundering. And William's troops surround them, blocking all the trade routes. And it becomes a massacre. And the king learns the lesson that it's better to make a truce than to continue fighting with William. And this actually will be the last time the king tries to mess with William. So over the next 10 years, William becomes really his role as conqueror and takes over the Duchy of Maine, which is another duchy nearby. He sends men to Brittany, and he builds strongholds to secure his borders. He's continuing to take land and make Normandy even stronger than it previously was. So in some ways, people consider him more powerful than the King of France at this time. Back to ruthless William. William was ruthless. I had mentioned earlier that his mother was supposedly the daughter of a tanner. In a rebellion at Alençon, the townspeople mocked supposedly his illegitimate birth by hanging animal hides from the walls, calling him the tanner's bastard.
Oh, that took me a second.
William responded by having the rebels' hands and feet chopped off.
Okay.
There's my William. There he is.
Brutal, yes, but he sent a clear message. You challenge William and you'll pay dearly. If anything, he's consistent.
That is the William we know and love right there. He's not the man you really want to mess with. You don't want to make jokes, guys. Don't joke around him. He can't take it. He would not be a fan of the roast.
William the Conqueror roast.
No.
Yeah, that would end in a massacre. Not so fun. Fast forward to 1064. Aaron, I know you covered some of this, so I'm going to really lightly go over it, and feel free to obviously insert your Harold piece in here. William claimed that years earlier, King Edward the Confessor of England had promised him the throne.
We should say there is a connection between them. They are relatives. They are,
yes,
like, what, first cousins removed or
yes.
something that I said. King Edward, the Confessor of England, his mom is from Normandy, Emma of Normandy. So they know each other. There's questions, obviously. If you want to hear all about that and the questions about whether or not he really promised William the throne, please listen to the Harold episodes. We deep dive into the succession issue.
And I didn't want to totally repeat it here, but they do show, if you're watching King and Conqueror in the first episode, they do show Edward the Confessor's mom embracing William, again, as family. Again, that connection that she came from Normandy. So when Edward died, Harold Godwinson took the throne and crown instead, and William saw that as a betrayal. One thing I did see in one of the documentaries, they talked about how in Norman law, the first designation of an heir is the one that's valid. Whenever you name whoever your heir is, that's the valid one, because they believed any deathbed changes could be done under duress or any other suspicious circumstances, if you're hallucinating or things like that. But the English believed that the last designation was the one that had legitimacy. So they brought up that as a potential piece that led to some of this conflict.
And we should say Harold Godwinson, again, if you have not listened to the other episodes, he was Edward the Confessor, the king's brother-in-law. So Edward was married to Harold's sister, Edith. Again, Edith, all the Ediths.
Other Edith.
That's their connection. Harold's not just some random dude. I remember growing up being like, how does Harold get there? He's part of the royal family, the wider royal family, but he's not royal himself.
No. And I think actually King and Conqueror, the show, does a good job in the first episode showing this. They do show the coronation of King Edward the Confessor, and they do set up the relationships pretty well, where you see his wife, who again is the sister of, as Aaron said, Harold, and then Edward the Confessor's mom, Emma, and her connection to William the Conqueror. I think even if you're not somebody who is really familiar with the time period, I think the show does show the blended connections and how you could see that both could be potential heirs. There's not one that's like, oh, that's clearly the guy who's going to take on the throne after.
And King Edward the Confessor had also spent much of his youth and adulthood in Normandy, so he is also very Norman. There's a huge Norman contingent at the court, as well as what you'd call the native Anglo-Saxons.
Right. And they do show that actually in the show too. They have Edward the Confessor, he's talking about his youth to William. They hint at their childhood together. So you get that idea, which I think is done well. I know they obviously take some liberties with history, but being able to at least see those relationships and how it's going to be complicated when Edward dies, I think is set up well from the first episode. As Aaron said, Harold's going to take the crown after Edward dies. You can listen to her episode to hear more about that. And William, of course, sees this as betrayal. Harold's nickname, right, Aaron, is the Oathbreaker. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, people consider him an oathbreaker. So as part of the Harold episodes, Harold did go to Normandy. Maybe he was shipwrecked there. Maybe he went there to promise the throne to William. There's conflicting ideas on that, but he swore on Edward the Confessor's death that he would support William the Conqueror's claim. According to William, Harold has made an oath that he will support his claim. He sees him as breaking that oath. He's sworn on holy relics, which means a hell of a lot at this time.
But I also like that in the episode, you also question that of why go all the way there to swear an oath?
That's what I'm saying is William, he's certain that he has been wronged by the fact that he has not gotten the throne. But that also is all coming from, a lot of this is coming from Norman writers after William already has the throne. It might be retroactive, fitting, and I know we'll obviously get into the Bayeux tapestry of it all too. This tapestry that shows basically the whole succession crisis up until the Battle of Hastings, what we're talking about in the Harold episodes and this episode. If you really want to hear all those issues with that succession, Harold episodes dive into it because it is a huge piece. But William, rightly or wrongly, feels like he is being denied the crown, and he feels like it is his, although we also talk about in those episodes that the crown of England has also been claimed by Danes. It has been claimed by Vikings. It's not just about legitimacy and you being given the crown. In the past, you have been able to sail across the sea and grab the crown itself. Even if William wasn't promised, this is still an open avenue. He can still go out and claim it because it has been done in the past. To be fair to William.
So he can use both his trying to say this legitimacy of I was promised, and he can do as he's done in the past, which is use force to get what he wants.
He wants to do both. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. We talk about in the episode what we believe, so I won't spoil it here because you should go back and listen to it. If you haven't, he's saying, yes, and I was given it by my kinsman, King Edward the Confessor, but also I am going to conquer it. Thank you.
And I have the men to do that. He plans to cross the English Channel. As we said, unfortunately, no channel. So he's got to cross it with ships. And he's going to take his quote unquote rightful crown by force. This plan by many is seen as almost pure madness because he's got to cross the channel with about 1,000 ships. In this case, in the middle of the night, he's going to need about 15,000 men, almost 5,000 horses. And, of course, all the provisions needed for that. Food and everything else.
And he's doing it he's doing it in the fall at the end of campaign season. He has this really small window in which to go and conquer. If he doesn't do it, He's going to have to sail home. And by the time he does it in a year, Harold, he'll have already consolidated his power. He's got this really tight window in which to go and conquer. And it's now.
Right. And it's a very obviously high-risk decision because of all those factors. But he does get the backing of other powerful dukes and landowners in surrounding areas. Of course, he promises them riches if they win. They back him, and the setup for the Battle of Hastings has begun. And I'm going to end it there and pick up with the Battle of Hastings, which I know, Aaron, you cover on Harold's side. I'm going to briefly cover it in the next episode and then more focus on William's rule after that. And his, of course, coffin. I was going to say exploding coffin, but...
Does he jump out of it? No, they just...
In some ways,
parts of him does.
Is it not a properly tailored coffin? Did they put it in the dryer on too high a temperature? What happened to this coffin?
Kind of.
Parts of him.
The too tight of the coffin actually is fitting. Too high of a temperature. Parts of him, parts of him jump out of the coffin.
Well, that had to be awkward.
Yeah. That I won't use in my judgment of him. Maybe that will impact, I guess, how you view him.
I don't know. In some ways, when you get to the end, you might be like, well deserved.
You're kicking the coffin. You're like, yeah, that's what you get.
Well, if we talk about England, so I know you're going to be covering Hastings, him consolidating his rule in England, and obviously the infamous harrying of the North, which is where a lot of his reputation is gained or lost. A lot of it lost there. At that point, you might want to shove him into a too small coffin.
Crank up the heat, shrink it a few sizes. Yes, but hopefully... with this episode, part 1, being able to build on who he was as a young person and the patterns that we will continue to see out of William and where some of those patterns potentially came from, some of his personality traits. Not that you can't blame him for it and judge him in our next episode in our judgment.
Absolutely will.
But you might keep in mind, again, how some of his younger years would have impacted and created the man who becomes the Conqueror.
It explains a little bit of the monstrous traits, for sure.
Yeah, you have to sneak in the monstrous piece. Erin's judgment has already been made. She's a Team Harold.
I'm not saying that just because I did Harold. I know there are going to be some questionable decisions that William's going to make in England once he gets in power. They're going to make you really difficult to like him, but I'm willing to give him a try. We've got a lot of death and gore coming up.
I'm not trying to convince you to make him, in our judgment, better than Harold.
You're not arguing on his behalf.
I'm not.
You're just laying out the dossier. This is the guy.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm just wanting to, especially in his childhood, add some just a little, I don't want to say devil's advocate, but adds, I think, some complexity to his story that I think can get let out.
Yeah, I think it's good. I know for me and most of us, we encounter William as a full-grown adult. He's well into middle age at this point as he goes into the Battle of Hastings. He jumps fully formed as a man into our history books. We don't get that rich texture about his life and what makes him into a man, makes him into a possible monster.
Yeah.
You can see, and if you go back and again listen to the Harold episodes, I think you could see their beginning parts of their lives have some key similarities, but then some really remarkable differences. You can see the parallel lives as they're leading up to the Battle of Hastings, but then how they diverge at parts. What make them into two similar men in a lot of ways, but also very, very different men.
What we can definitely say is very complex men. Yeah, certainly not 2D, very flat. There's a lot of complexity to who William is and kind of what brought him there, and same with Harold, what brought them to the Battle of Hastings as the men they were.
How they got there. They've both went through a lot of hardship. Both of their fathers have sort of untimely ends, although Harold gets to have his father for a lot longer. His mentorship under his father is a lot longer. William certainly, I think, has the harder go of it. I will say that for him.
That's part 1. So stick around for part 2 here, hopefully shortly. I know with the holidays, schedules get a little crazy, but hopefully here in the next week or 2 will be part 2. And that will wrap up our dueling villains, or dueling offenders would be more correct, seeing which of the two are the greater offender in this story. Anything else you want to say, Aaron?
No, I just guess Matt and I, we need to catch up on King and Conqueror.
We do.
Well, I've only watched 1 episode, so I can only say from there, but I thought it did, based on what I knew, I thought it at least established the relationships especially in a kind of complicated picture like this. I thought it captured them well and set things up for what's to come. That obviously, I know it's going to come.
You don't really get a ton of Battle of Hastings. Even like William the Conqueror, people might know his name, but there's not really a lot of like pop culture. Harold's been in some Vikings, some of those shows. It's been more one-off. It's exciting every time you do get one of these series. Again, it's not the Tudors where you get one every single year. For that, I'm thankful. And I will put aside some of the stuff that I know about it. For me, it's just more like, does it capture the essence of it? There will be certain things that you'll expect to see, but it's, again, more, does it capture something? Does it capture the idea of the characters and that time? Is more what I'm looking for.
And the relationships and those bigger intricacies. As I said, please rate, review, follow us on Instagram. Aaron always does amazing posts for our episodes. Like and subscribe. All those things are things that we appreciate from all of our listeners. And of course, you can join us on Patreon as well if you want some additional content or you have ideas for future offenders. That's a great place to help us do that and get your say.
Yeah, we have an episode from last month on Emma of Normandy, who is Edward the Confessor's mom, another Norman. So if you want to learn more about her, because she's very interesting, and she's in the show.
She's in the show, and she, as we said, is somebody who William is related to. And will, I guess, in some ways, build his legitimacy on that side.
She was a power broker in her own right.
Yes.
Very fascinating lady.
They definitely portray her like that on the show so far. Been like, okay, yeah, that fits. That fits. So we'll end it there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aaron and Matt. And we'll see you. We'll talk to you all.
We'll hear everyone.
We'll hear you. Or you'll hear us in the near future.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.